Hello, everybody. Some of you have heard me talk before. Some of you have heard my rants and my raves. I suppose before I get into things today, I'm going to give sort of my rant of the year, which is a lot of us are gardeners. I am familiar with everybody saying, you know, oh, I'm just a gardener. And I think that we need to rethink how we approach what we do, whether it's a hobby or a profession. I'm lucky it was a hobby that became a profession, and it's still my hobby. What do I do on my day off? I garden. And I think we need to realize the power that we have. It doesn't matter what your challenge is. We can solve all the problems in the world with gardening. Everything from increasing your immune system with actually physically working in the soil. It is proven to lower street crime and increase productivity to garden. We can increase food security, which I perceive to be the main challenge that we have right now through the current crisis. There's so many ways that gardening can fix everything. And what we're going to do tonight is to talk about one of those ways by gardening to create ways to hold and handle rainwater. Now, we talk about low impact development. Not a term I love. It's a very engineering term, and I've tried to talk them out of it. But I prefer rainscaping when I talk about this sort of idea. Why do we need it? Because before development, before we covered all the land with houses, roughly a third of the water that fell in the ground would evaporate away, a third of it would soak into the ground, and a third of it would run off into the creeks. And now most of it runs very quickly off into the storm sewers, which lead to the creeks. Most people don't really think about the water once it goes into the ground and once it goes into the storm sewers, and they don't really think about where that goes. We need to try and reverse that, and that's what low impact development is all about, all of the different ways that you can try and get back to pre-development water flow. And there's lots of things that we can do in that, and some of them you already know about. You know about stormwater ponds. Most people know about rain gardens. Everybody knows about rain barrels. Infiltration trenches, you may know what a French well is. It's a hole dug in the ground filled with gravel. An infiltration trench is a sort of a glorified French well. It's a larger, more engineered system. Evaporation ponds, any pond can be an evaporation pond. A pond is going to evaporate away about 1 inch of water a day just through its regular running. So for instance, in my garden, I have my downspouts routed into the rain garden, into a bog, which then flows into the pond. And so it evaporates that water away, which cools the world and reduces the heat island effect and all that good stuff. Bioretention gardens and bioswales, we'll talk about that. There's some engineered features. Xeriscaping is drought tolerant landscaping, and that's a really cool way of saving water, because it's really all about water. Why is drought tolerant landscaping part of low impact development? Because if we're designing with plants that need less water, and therefore we're watering less, then the next time it rains, the ground is dry and ready to soak up the next rainfall. So it's really important to look at all aspects of water in the landscape. Even green roofing can be a form of low impact development, because 95% of rainfall events can be captured by green roofing. Most rainfall events are tiny things. They're not the giant storms. With those, we're looking to sort of capture what we can, and then yes, the rest will run off. But for most of us, we're looking at just getting those 95%, and then holding a little bit during the heavy rainfall events as well. So these are all things that we can look toward. We've looked for so long about getting water away from the foundation, getting it away from the house, and that's important. But we've put too much of a focus on that, and we've put a focus on what happens when we get to the end. So we've looked at things like stormwater ponds, which are a valid way to handle water, but they're not the only way to handle water. And if you focus on any one method too much, then you can have issues. For instance, with stormwater ponds, if you have too many stormwater ponds, all of the water, everything that flows off your roof, your car, everything ends up in the stormwater pond and gets concentrated there. So when the time comes to dredge out the silt, then it can be actually literally toxic and be terribly expensive to get rid of, and not a good thing. Whereas if we're dealing with it on the what we call the lot level on our properties, then nothing gets to be that concentration. I like to think of most problem solving as there isn't one big way to solve all of the world's problems. There's a whole bunch of little ways and a bunch of levers, and you don't yank on this one or push on it. You instead have all these spread out in front of you, and you push on this one a little bit and you pull on that one a little bit, and together you can solve most of the problems that need solving. One of the big things, the big practical things about rain gardens is that because we have this sort of boom and bust cycle, so when it rains hard, the rivers flow and then they go down to a trickle. When I was a kid, the rivers were wide and shallow, and now they're narrow and deep because most of the water isn't getting to the creeks, and it's certainly not getting there in an even way, shall we say. So if you live on a waterway, if you're on the outside of a curve, you're losing land. And if you're on the inside of the curve, maybe you're getting land, but it's not really good land. It's sort of mushy, not usable land. So cities, municipalities are spending enormous amounts of money remediating this, and that can go to making the world. $14 million Mississauga spent on Cooksville Creek one year to deal with erosion. So there are many reasons to do low impact development. We don't really think of the value of water either. I'm a big believer that if I can't get people with the "it's the right thing to do" idea, then I will get them through their pocketbook to show people the value of water, recreational use, commercial fishing, the costs of remediating issues. Flooding and property damage can range into the hundreds of millions, even billions in some cases. And then your property value might go up or down if you're near a waterway that's having issues as well. And then we have lawsuits against municipalities when things are poorly handled. It's more than just a rain garden. It's more than just water too. Many of the plants that we would use in rain gardens, and we'll get to that, are also good for biodiversity. Everybody's interested in save the bees, save the monarchs. And yes, I know that's not a monarch, nor is that a bee, but it's about the big picture. It's about all of the creatures together and all of the different ways of handling the water flow. So, you know, the more native plants that we use, the better. Native plants tend to be really good in rain garden situations. I don't know why particularly. It would seem to me that native plants have to put up with a lot of adversity, that native plants have to deal with wild swings in temperature, hot, humid summers, cold, wet winters. So our native plants tend to be fairly bulletproof. And that's what makes a good rain garden plant, a plant that can stand flooding and drought. These are ideas that are very important when you're picking your plants. Now, I'm a big believer that you never ever need to sacrifice anything to create beauty. So if you're solving a problem, be it I'm trying to keep deer out of my garden, be it I want to grow edibles for food security, regardless of what the problem is that you're trying to solve, I don't think you ever need to give up beauty. I think that's very important to remember. If you follow the same, I'm not a big rule-driven guy, but if you follow the same sort of guidelines, then you can have a beautiful garden. And the first guideline to creating a beautiful garden, to me, is texture. Flowers come and go. Texture will make or break your garden. In the upper corner of that screen, you'll see a beautiful water garden. That's actually at the Chudley's farm, the apple people. And it has good texture. It's got sword-shaped texture, it's got bold texture, it's got intermediate texture. The lower picture on that screen is actually my little rain garden. Interestingly, I only have one tiny rain garden. Almost all of the water droplets on my property are handled in different ways, non-traditional ways. I have bold texture there, I've got sword-shaped texture, and I have the intermediate texture as well. So you can see, even though there's no flowers in that picture, it's still beautiful. It's the bold texture that's going to make it, the bold sword-shaped and fluffy texture. Color is important. It's not all about flowers, even when we talk about color. There's fall color, but now we live in a very lucky time where there's a kaleidoscope of color available through leaves, things like the heuchers and so on, and the hostas. There's some beautiful plants out there, and even some of the nativars. That means cultivars of native plants. There's some gorgeous stuff. There's a white turtlehead, and there's a new one out called Black Ace, which is lovely. You may notice that there's two fairly horrid plants in the upper right picture there. Upper right, upper left. That is creeping bellflower and daylily. And they were between two driveways, and I was quite horrified to see them on a job. And then I realized that they weren't going anywhere, and they were actually kind of pretty together. When we handle color, what we maybe use complementary colors or contrasting colors. You could be talking about color echo, which is where you have all sorts of different shades of the same color grouping. Mauves and blues and purples, for instance. Creams and yellows would be another example. So how we use color is still very important, but it comes after texture, and I think it's really, really important to remember. Plants, I can't say that my garden is all native, but the more that I work with native plants, the more that I love them. Lobelia, great blue lobelia is a gorgeous plant and fairly bulletproof plant as well. In my own garden, that's actually 2 out of 3 of these are my own garden. The cattails that are there, that's in my evaporation pond. They even have beautiful fall color. Don't forget about the fall color of plants. And we can plant some really, really nifty things. I have a bog as part of my evaporation pond complex. And that's a funny thing to say. I have an evaporation pond complex. The pitcher plants that are there are really, really cool plant. And they're a perfect candidate for a bog as well. One of my common themes is avoiding the use of invasives. I sit on a subcommittee of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. If you want to learn more about that, you can look up Grow Me Instead Ontario. And there's a whole of them options. We'd really rather you didn't grow invasive species like Norway maple. So here are some better plants that you could choose. And for instance, in the photo there, that is ruby lace honey locust, and it is a lovely, lovely plant, gorgeous plant. Sneezeweeds, poorly named. There's a whole bunch of plants that really deserve some marketing effort. You could call this Helen's flower. That sounds much better. It doesn't cause allergies, it doesn't cause sneezing, but it is a great plant for rain gardens because it is a fen plant. A fen is an area that dries out in the summer but is super wet or flooded in the springtime. Another plant that you'll see there on the picture with the orange flowers, the yellow flowers underneath it, are fireworks goldenrod, and that is another lovely plant to have in the garden. It doesn't spread like Canada goldenrod does. It spreads just right. It's got beautiful texture, and it's both of these plants. In fact, most of the plants that we're going to talk about are also brilliant for pollination, which is kind of we will have a summary table of plants, but sometimes folks can use their phone. This will also be available to be downloaded by people. I know that they're going to have this for you afterwards. Some great plants overall in the landscape. Just because they're good for rain gardens doesn't mean that they aren't also good plants. Little Devil 9-bark, all of the 9-barks are brilliant. They're all different sizes too, which is good. I'm a big fan of marsh marigold, and I use it in combination with other plants. So if there's an area that's a little moist, then I might plant marsh marigold so it comes up in the spring, does its thing, and when it gets dry, it's going to die down and go dormant and then come up next spring. Pickerel weed was a bit of a surprise for me. It's a butterfly magnet, wonderful plant. Blue flag iris is a gorgeous mid-spring blooming flower, although weird spring this year, very, very late spring, which maybe is a good thing. So these are all great plants for the rain garden. I think we need to remember trees. If you've got a wet corner in your yard, or even near the rain garden, you can have something like a larch. And to me, this is a forsythia tree. It's just a big, beautiful ball of color in the fall, glowingly red, even after all the leaves have fallen off everything else. If you drive up into the Orangeville area so that you're going over the drumlins and eskers and so on, you'll see in the hills, after all the leaves have fallen off, these gold pockets of the larch trees. A beautiful, beautiful tree and great for biodiversity as well. Asters, I'm a big fan of combinations. I don't think like a landscape architect. I'm a landscape designer, and there's a difference. And I think in terms of vignettes. I design so that I'll have a spring vignette, and then a summer vignette, and then a fall vignette, and then there will be a couple of things that sort of last all season or for multiple seasons in between the bones of the landscape, as they say. So I'm a big fan of asters. There are some lovely asters out there. Turtleheads are beautiful, and if you've ever watched turtlehead in the garden, look at the big burly bumblebees. They're the only ones that can muscle their way into the flowers of turtlehead. And if you're talking about the native turtlehead, then it is food for the beautiful Baltimore checker spot butterfly. I've only ever seen one of those, and it was just a lovely creature. Textbooks tend to be very black and white about sun and shade, and I am not. Based on my experience, I grew up in a sugar bush over by Crawford Lake, and on the north side of the house, the true north side of the house, it was oriented north-south, we had trees there as well. So it was really shady. Only in the, a couple of hours in the day would it get a lot of sunlight. And yet I could grow things. I didn't know any better. Nobody was telling me you can't do that. Kind of like the coyote when he discovers gravity. I was just planting plants because they would be pretty. And they would flower. Maybe they'd flower a little less, but they'd still flower. And I could have like in the foreground of that picture, double flowering almond. I would have clematis growing on the railing of over that pond and so on. Try it. If it works, it works. I used to have purple comb flowers in the shady part of the garden, and they did reasonably well. In retrospect, when I saw what they did in the full sun, it was different. But you can still try things, and you can have great success with stuff. One of the bigger lessons that most gardeners, including me, need to learn, I still make this mistake, is the right size plant for the place. Visit botanical gardens, see how plants really grow if they're not being trimmed and globed and bushed and so on by homeowners. This is Diablo 9-bark. It was sort of one of the first really colorful leafed shrubs out there, but it's a monster. It gets 10 feet by 10 feet easily. I saw it in a garden down in New Brunswick, and I was like, good heavens, they get that big? My gosh. So be aware, read the plant label. There are things that you can dwarf plants, but then you're finding it forever in the right place. This is a very partial list, and we'll have plant lists later, as I said, a very partial list of plants that are good for rain gardens. Now, there's a lot of factors that you might look at. Flood tolerance, there are plants that can stand long periods of flooding, like winterberry or sparkleberry. There are plants that can stand a little bit of flooding, like yarrows and so on. So, and some plants would do better in sandy soil, and some in clay, some in shade, some in sun. Experiment with it, play. I kill a lot of plants, but I'm learning how to do it. And I move a lot of plants around if I find that they're not doing well. There is no ASPCA for plants. No one's going to come and arrest you if you're not treating a plant fairly. This was a neat project that we did for one of the conservation authorities. And this was to show people in a community where we were going to be doing some rain gardens, what rain gardens could look like. So I was given some homes to sort of theorize landscapes for, and then sort of make them real digitally speaking. So this is a nice little house, little bungalow. And in the upper portion of the screen, you'll see the aerial bird's eye view of the landscape design. And then in the bottom, you'll see that there are, that pathway would be over an infiltration trench. So that would be a deep excavation filled with gravel. The other pathway that has the, I don't know if you can see my mouse, that has the thyme growing in it, that is a permeable pathway. Anything that lets water flow through into the ground is good. The landscape is a drought tolerant landscape. And back here hidden away would be rain barrels as well. So it doesn't take a lot to make a garden into a low impact development or a rainscape. Now, you would also know that here there would be a berm across the bottom there. What that would mean is that water flowing onto the permeable pathway would track around. If it filled that permeable pathway, then it would be captured, and for a very limited amount of time, it would be held there and soaked into the ground. So it would take a lot for that to escape from there. If you're lucky enough to have a cottage like this, I'm filled with envy, but you can have a cottage style garden. And if we look at this, we'll see rain barrels on either side by the downspouts. When those overflow, that water would flow down the little dry creek there and into an evaporation pond. You'll note that the pathways are all gravel. You could have infiltration trenches under the gravel pathways as well. And again, all of the plantings are super drought tolerant. So there's a lot of different levers that have been adjusted to make that as rainscape friendly as we possibly could. And you can even have a formal design. Again, that's an evaporation pond. That large formal flag pathway is bounded by a hedge of little devil 9-barks. And then we've got plants like daylilies and gay feather in there, liatris, lots of different super drought tolerant plants. And then underneath that patio, you don't even have to have it look like it's a rainscape. You can have a big infiltration trench under that patio and then just build right over it so that it's visually not there. Not my favorite way to handle rainwater, just because I believe that if you're going to do this, you can be a great example to your neighbors. I have a little sign by my rain garden explaining what a rain garden is, and people actually stop and read the sign, which is kind of cool. So you can, I prefer sort of above ground examples that I can show people why it's a good thing. But you know, if that's not your shtick, then certainly it can be done below ground. Everybody knows about rain barrels. There's a neat new gizmo out there from a company called irrigatia.ca. And you'll see that little black box on the wall that's got the sort of cables and hoses coming from it. You can have this, I believe, 80 feet from the rain barrel, and it's a little battery-powered device that will suck water out of the rain barrel and then slowly squirt it into the garden. And so by the time the next rainfall rolls around, you're ready to capture it, you're ready to hold it. This was a garden that was supposed to go in early spring, and there were delays, and we ended up not getting in the veggies until early July. And yet, so late, because there was constant moisture, there was still tomatoes available at the end of the season for harvest. And it was a great way of handling all that water. You'll note that if you look at the rain barrels, there are black hoses attached to the rain barrels. That's the overflow for the rain barrels. Those are run in series, those barrels. So as one fills, they all fill. And then if they overflow, they all overflow together. And it's very important to get the water 2 meters, at least 2 meters from the foundation. 2 to 3 meters is the general guideline. You don't want the water flowing back right in at your foundation. It is still important to get the water away so that we keep your basement dry. But that's a really good way to deal with rain barrels, a really easy way to deal with them. I'm forever telling people that gardening should be fun. We forget sometimes, we get awfully serious about gardening, and it's supposed to be a blast. The white barrel that's there, a friend of mine did her, she painted it white, she took a rain barrel to school, and then had her students do their handprints on there, and then built a whole lesson plan around it. The one that's yellow, that's a little too Jackson Pollock for me, but that's okay. It's their garden. And you've got to remember that. There are people who vehemently hate my garden, and I'm okay with that. I don't want everybody to love my garden. I don't want the elevator music of gardening. I want an unusual garden. I want my garden. So have all the fun you want to have. Now, when we talk about rain barrels, the people who give them to you or subsidize them for you, the municipalities and the conservation authorities, in my mind, they miss a really key element of this. I'd like to see them be more vocal about the purpose of rain barrels. Most people think that the rain barrel is to capture water so that they can use it to water their plants. Well, that's a great idea, but it's about more than that. It's about hold and release. It's about hang on to the water during a rainfall event and then slowly soak it into the garden between rainfall events. So the easiest way to do that is, other than that irrigation system that I just talked about, but the easiest way is to have a soaker hose on the bottom of the rain barrel. So you'd create a hose that's about 2 meters long. You can cut the end off a hose and put a kit on it to make it a shorter hose. And then you'd hook that up to one of those sweating hoses and run the sweating hose through the garden. And that way, after it hasn't, it's rained, give it a couple of days and then open that up and just let it soak into the ground. And that'll do the job. Hold and release. That's what rain gardening is all about. And it's what rain barrels are all about. So it's worth remembering. And it can be something really simple like this as well. That's sort of my style. I don't get too carried away with things. So it's now, like I said, have fun with gardening. This is at my house. Those of you who've seen my garden, or those of you who haven't, would be surprised to know that I live in a rental house. Much to the chagrin of my landlord, I cut a hole in the downspout and I put a rain chain in, and so the water follows that down. It fills this sink that's here. We raised the drain, the water fills the sink and then pours down, and we've actually made a much bigger barrel underneath that that sink, and that becomes a rainwater reservoir. And then we fill our watering cans from that, and then we water things like the edibles, we water things like new plantings and so on. So it's sort of a glorified rain barrel, and it's just plain fun. This is a different type of system. This is a much more commercial system, much more commercial than I'm a fan of. I'm a very simple guy when I garden. What we have here is, now you'll note that there's a problem here in this picture. If we were live, I would say, who can see what the problem is there? There's a first flush filter. So the downspout goes in and that takes all the sediment out before it delivers the water where it's going to go. The problem is that that first flush filter is right against the foundation. That's exactly where you don't want to be infiltrating water. But this is a really neat system. These are using aqua cubes, and so they're sort of milk crates on steroids. They can stand a load. They're engineered, and you would line this area if you were going to harvest the rainwater. And if you weren't, then you would just put landscape fabric around it. And so that whole area can fill up. And in this case, they're using the water elsewhere in the property, or the area could fill up and then soak away into the ground. So it's just another way of handling the water. And I'm a big fan of those. There are many systems like this. As I say, these are the aqua cubes. There's also eco blocks. And I've used them. I've used them both actually, and they're a really effective way to build a rain garden. This is my bog or evaporation pond. As I say, my garden is English cottage on steroids. It is not a well manicured garden by any means, so people may not like it. But what we have is the rain flows. Let's see if this will work. Hey, it's working. So the rain flows down that downspout. It flows through that trough there, and it goes, I've cleared away so you can see it's lined with rubber pond liner, and then it flows into the bog. The bog cleans the water. What happened there? The wonders of modern technology. And then it dumps it into the pond. So the bog cleans the water, cool plants there like royal fern and umbrella leaf and sedge grasses and Joe pie weed, and then it dumps it in the pond. And then that keeps it recirculating and then helps it evaporate away. And that's the pond itself. It's a lovely structure to have in the garden, and it gives me hours of pleasure and masks street noises. And a pond will raise the value of your house by 3%, which is good to know. A good permeable patio will raise the value of your house by 12%. So these are good numbers to talk about. These things don't even have to ultimately cost money. I'm in the enviable position. I sell the only thing other than a Rolls Royce that goes up in value after you buy it. Landscaping does really well for your property values. If you renovate your bathroom, you get back 76 cents on the dollar. Well, that's a terrible investment. Landscaping is a great investment. This is an edible landscape that I did in Oakville, super sandy soil, so the rain garden could be as deep as it wanted to be, but it didn't need to be because the water flowed away very quickly. Marsh marigolds, this is an all edible landscape, so you can see the serviceberry in the background. The marsh marigolds that are there are delicious. You cook the leaves like spinach and so on, and they like the spring flooding, and they just go dormant when it's too dry. They would plant either corn, which is a fairly heavy water feeder, or watermelons in that rain garden, because, as I said, all edible. Same garden, backyard, evaporation pond, permeable pathways, black granite gravel. And again, even though in this case, we're doing two major things, we're capturing every drop of water, but we're also growing a whole bunch of food on this property. That's a beautiful garden. It's not a sacrifice at all. Rain chains, there's some beautiful rain chains ideas out there now, and some fun ideas as well. The one with the rocks, that was Canada Blooms. No need to back away, don't worry. That was at Canada Blooms a couple of years ago, and a really effective way, sculptural way of handling the water. This is at my house. I tend to try and keep water above ground wherever I can. I created an infiltration trench under my parking pad so that it would take all of the water off one portion of the roof and soak it into the ground. But I ran it into the ground and into a drainage tile that led the water into that infiltration trench. And I don't know what happened, if leaves clogged it up at the bottom, or there's any number of things that when you're running water under the ground, something could crawl up there and die. Maybe it freezes up at the bottom. Any number of things can happen. But in this particular instance, something happened, it froze or whatever, and then there was a heavy rain and a fast melt. The snow that was on the roof all melted, and there was water shooting up about 3 feet out of the ground. Now, fortunately, that's the garage, so it was a no harm, no foul situation. But I since then, I've made a real effort to keep water above the ground. I now have a rain chain that's there, and that guides the water down and lets it flow right into that infiltration trench. As much as I say I'm a big fan of natives, you'll note that there are zinnias there in those pots. Those red flowers are zinnias, and zinnias are great for butterflies as well. Sometimes these initiatives are mandated by various communities. So if you have if you need to make your commercial parking lot larger, that's a church in Mississauga, they were told that because there was a cold water creek nearby, they needed to capture all of the water and slow it and cool it. That's another thing that rain gardens do, is they cool the water before the water gets to the creeks, because warm water reaching the creek can be very damaging. You think of, and the salt that's in that water reaching the creek and what it would do to the fish eggs and to the fish fry that are in there. And the original garden was very wild, and the client, the owner of the property, didn't really love it. So we went in and we created much larger masses of plants, plants that would sort of visually hold their own. When we have a whole bunch of plants jumbled together, I actually call it jumble syndrome, because people don't see the beauty of plants if they're all mashed together in ones and twos. If you make large drifts of plants, it has much more visual impact. This is an interesting property. This is a grassless landscape in Oakville before grassless landscapes were cool. This is a heavy clay soil in a fairly new subdivision. You'll see that there's a downspout there against the house. The water flows into a dry creek. It is lined with rubber, to get the water away from the foundation for 2 meters. Then it's not lined for a little bit, and then there's actually a rubber-lined pit in the ground that would capture water and use it as a 200-year-old copper pot there, and that will recirculate the water till it evaporates away. So we were able to use the water for an ornamental feature there. What you can't really see in that picture, where those giant rocks are, there's a berm that runs all the way around that water feature. So in a heavy rain event, that whole area can slowly fill and then soak away. And again, the plants in the picture, we've got potentilla, which is a great rain garden plant. We have cedars, thuya, which is another great rain garden plant. We have salt-tolerant sea thrift from Ontario's ocean coast. Everybody forgets that Ontario has an ocean coast up there on the shores of Hudson's Bay. Not exactly desirable real estate yet, but beautiful plants. And then there's a silver maple, which is another native there. So a lot of good can be done in that one little itty bitty garden, and a lot of water captured actually. Maybe just look at where the water's already flowing to. Maybe you don't need to re-engineer the whole world. If you can see where the water flow is, you can just sort of enhance that and build it up a little bit. In this case here, on the lower picture with the berries there, that's one of my favorite plants, by the way. That's winterberry. And then we can see blue flag iris behind the winterberry, sedge grasses in the background. And all we did, there was a bit of a slope that was there. So we cut soil from one side and bermed it up on the other side. So we created a fairly large chamber. And again, this is Milton clay. There are brickyards in Milton. I have bricks that say Milton on them that were made here. It's clay, real clay. And yet this would infiltrate most of the water from that roof within just a few hours. It's actually not that difficult. If you're dealing with clay soil, I would not make the soil more than, the rain garden rather, more than 6 to 8 inches deep. That way it can fill and then soak away in 24 to 48 hours. If it's a sandy soil, then you can make it as deep as you want. If it's really free draining soil, it can be up to a foot and a half deep. So that's important to remember, that in clay soil, you want it to be much more shallow. There are two main rules. We talked about one of them already. Get the water away from the foundation by 2 meters. And the other is that we want a rain garden to drain within 24 to 48 hours. That's very important. This garden, you can't even see the rain gardens that are there. Where the purple flowers are in the background, there's a rain garden. And actually where the purple flowers are in the foreground, there's a rain garden. And then water that gets across the pathway, where the bearded irises are in the middle of the picture, there's a dip on the other side where the viburnum is, that is also a rain garden. So it doesn't even have to look like a rainscape. It can if you want. And on top of that, this is a super drought tolerant garden as well. This was a neat project that we had in Toronto. We actually tapped into a spring by accident, and we had a lot of water, this much water all the time, a whole big O worth of water flowing through. And we guided it around the house, and then there's a series of stepped down gardens. You can see there's a catch basin there, a manhole cover. It's tough to tell in the picture, but it drops down. You look at the size of the river rock, they'll give it scale. It drops down from that. So that whole giant area could fill in a heavy rain event, and then it would overflow into the catch basin. And we were able to capture all of the water coming out of the sump pump, plus all of the water that was coming out of the backyard, and it only filled in heavy rain events. And remember, this isn't HGTV. Gardens shouldn't be instant. This is what the garden looked like when we built it. You can see on the left side of the screen that it doesn't look like much. And then there it is a year later, and then 3 years later. Gardens sleep, creep, then leap, and that's important to remember. A really easy way to build a rain garden is to just make the whole garden bigger by a couple of feet and dig a trench across the front of the garden, and then plant it up with suitable candidates as far as plants go, and guide the water into a rubber-lined, river rock covered dry creek to break the flow, to slow the flow, to break the erosion, and then it just pours right into the garden. And that garden didn't look like much when it was done, but it filled in beautifully. It's not going to be 100% success. I tried a plant there, I tried a Roseanne geranium that didn't do very well. So a couple of them may have passed on. And then we tried the great blue lobelia, and that worked like a charm. And that handled all of that water. And if it ever did overflow in a really heavy rain event, or even a series of rain events, then it would wick up into the garden and then overflow onto the grass. Some beautiful plants that you can have. This is a black Gamecock Louisiana iris. This is a gorgeous plant. This was a neat project. You can see in the center there's Bowles golden iris, Bowles golden sedge rather. This poor lady, all of the neighbors' water channeled to her property, and she called. She constantly had this lake there, and so we dug out close to the cedars. We kept the cedars, of course. Why not? We dug out close to the cedars, and we created a little creek that would be dry when it wasn't raining and wet when it was, and that little difference kept all of the water in place there and soaked it into the ground, but made it look more beautiful. We really didn't change anything but adding the plants and changing of the grade, so it kept the water in a tighter area. This is a bioretention garden. Most of you aren't going to encounter bioretention gardens on a regular basis. They are engineered rain gardens, basically. This is the only time that I would suggest using an engineered mix. Generally speaking, I would tell people to plant for the soil that you have, and then the plants will do well. A lot of people talk about excavating it out and then using a sand compost mix or something like that, and I'm not a big fan of that. For starters, if it has water in it for a few days, the organic matter in there could begin to break down anaerobically and putrefy and then poison your plants. So I'm a fan rather of planting the plants that can stand the soil that you have. So as it happens, this is very sandy soil in Mississauga down by Rattray Marsh, and we engineered the plants to stand those conditions. We chose plants that did that. In an bioretention cell, if you don't have decent enough drainage, and that particular job would infiltrate 70 millimeters of water an hour, which is incredible. You might, but if you didn't have that good drainage, you might have an underdrain to take water away to a lower area or to a sewer. And that's going to hold a lot of water, actually, surprising amount of water, and then let the extra flow away. And then you're going to have a saucer-shaped area in the top and plant it up with suitable plants. Now, you're probably going to notice, if you're on the ball, you're going to notice that there's a whole bunch of tree roots that were cut there. So in this particular job, we excavated a large area out and filled it with a special sand compost mix, because this is an engineered garden. The tree had diplodia blight. It was going to die. I wasn't worried about cutting the roots. I figured we'd leave the tree. When it died, it would be taken out. And then we channeled all the water there. You know, that tree is doing better because of all the water that flows to there now. That tree is actually recovering from the diplodia blight, which kind of blows me away. And Bioswales, another way of engineered handling of rainwater. This, by the way, is proof that you just need to pick the right plants. This is pure clay, the old shore of Lake Iroquois, and this is pure clay soil, and all of those plants are thriving there. It's not irrigated. We've got ironweed there. We've got cardinal flower in the bioswale in the ditch. We've got sedge grasses. We've got cup plant in the background. There is flowering raspberry. There's all sorts of beautiful plants that are doing perfectly well in that sandy soil. The pallets are actually remarkable that you can have. This is the commercial style of rainwater harvesting that really is only feasible in Ontario on a massive scale, where you might be building a new build. You might put in something like this to capture as much water as possible and to have that be used for evaporative cooling or toilets or whatever. But just so that you know it's there, and that actually shows you those aquacubes that I was on about earlier, how they create void space and allow water to sit and be used elsewhere. One of the biggest things you can do, strip away impervious surfaces and create gardens or permeable pathways and so on. It's a pretty straightforward thing to do, and it's not as hard as you think. It's doable. These are examples of more permeable surfaces. There's interlocking brick that's engineered to be permeable. I love black granite gravel. I love the way it sounds when you walk on it. It almost tinkles when you walk on it. I like this, the picture with the 2 concrete strips there. That's in Houston. And we think of Houston as being dry, but when it rains in Houston, it rains. And the idea of just having 2 strips, I think is brilliant. What are you doing going up the driveway that you need the whole thing surfaced anyway? So that works very well to create more infiltration zone. This is a really cool plant too. A really cool product called EcoRaster. It's engineered in Germany, built in Ontario with recycled materials, and you fill those honeycombs with either ornamental gravel or, in this case, a clover mix, and you can drive on it, you can drive trucks on it, you can plow it, and yet it's 100% permeable. Water can flow in very easily. I really love this system. Yeah, just another option. And this is an unusual thing too. This is Envirolok bags, and Envirolok bags are interesting. They're sort of glorified sandbags, and if the fellow who sells them ever heard me say that, I imagine he wouldn't be terribly happy. These are a really cool idea where you fill the bag with soil. If I have my way, I like to use the soil that's on site. So if I had a hillside, I might cut the soil from here and then use that soil to fill the bags to build the retaining wall. You can also buy them pre-filled. Why is this part of this talk? Beyond the fact that you're not blasting anything out of the escarpment and hauling it all over Ontario with great big diesel engines, you are, so there's a lower carbon footprint with that, and you're not creating concrete, which is also very carbon intensive. But if you're building a retaining wall, then you have to create really, really good drainage behind it so that water doesn't freeze and push it over eventually. That's the opposite with this. This system is designed to absorb water and let the water flow through and flow out. And then you vegetate the wall with anything from hydroseeding to this, in this case, the plants that you would use in a dry stone wall. You could even just stick willow and dogwood twigs in there and have it be quite successful. You can even use these for what we call riparian restoration, which is kind of cool also. But yeah, just there's so many different options and new ideas coming along all the time. One of my favorite things about gardening is that I will never be bored. There's always new things to learn and new ways of doing things. If you must irrigate, and I get it, maybe you need to irrigate during establishment because you're using drought tolerant plants. And one of the big ironies of drought tolerant plants is that you need to water them more. You need to care for them more for that first season. So maybe you have an irrigation system or a temporary irrigation system. Make sure you're putting the water right at the roots of the plants. That's also going to mean less disease. It's going to mean less evaporation. As soon as you put water in the air, you lose 30%, which is amazing when you think about it. Water early in the morning, water seldom and deeply. So they say an inch a week, but all at once. Not a big fan of automatic systems. There are smart irrigation systems. If you're going to hire someone, make sure that they are WSIP certified, WSIP, Water Smart Irrigation Professional. They will know all of the tricks to save as much water as possible. Mulching the plantings is important. And why does this matter? This matters because 60% of the potable water that we use ends up on the landscape. That's crazy. The miracle of potable water is very expensive. And during an election cycle, you don't hear anyone saying, I want to pay more taxes. If we want to save the municipalities a bunch of money, save a bunch of the water that we use. It's entirely doable. And those are the tricks to it. I love questions, and we're going to take questions right now. Yeah, we're reasonably on time for once. I also like public questions, so feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. You can email me for sure, but public questions mean that everyone learns from the answers. So feel free to find me and reach me on social networking. Kim, you're gonna, I believe, be tracking questions
Yes, I do
for
have.
us. I can't. Hey, awesome. There you are.
I do have a few questions that people have asked, and for
Yes.
anyone else that wants to ask any questions, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a little icon for asking questions. So you can type in your question there, and I can read it out to Sean. And we also have a little document icon in there where you can download Sean's presentation from today, and a little bit of information about the land trust as well. So that information is there already for you to access. So one comment that we received from Christine was there's a really great PBS show about water called H2O, the molecule that made us. So it sounds like it could be a really cool thing for us to watch.
Brilliant.
And we received a question from Helene, a bit out of subject, but are there any native hostas?
No. The closest you're going to get to that for the rain garden world, there are two plants. Marsh marigolds have a good bold texture. The Ontario plant palette doesn't have a whole lot of bold, so that's one option. And if you're really dialed in to native plant nurseries, and Credit Valley Conservation has a really good list of those, maybe you can find skunk cabbage, and it has exactly the hosta look. If it gets too hot in the summertime, it just goes dormant. But I usually plant it surrounded by other plants that are going to cover it over. So those are probably your two best bets, but no, there are no native hostas. Now, an alternative, if you're looking for bold texture, there's a technique called coppicing, where you might take a shrub that's overgrown and cut it all the way back to the ground. Now, I say that, and people nod and smile, but nobody really believes me. I actually did an experiment with my students, and I said, all the way back, I mean, all the way back. Don't leave anything above the ground. And they all wimped out and cut stuff back to here. Aim for slightly below the ground. I don't want to see anything but little circles. Now, where am I going with this? If you were to plant something like basswood, which is a lovely native plant, and you plant the tree and then you give it a year or two and cut it right to the ground, then it will come up with giant tropical-like leaves, edible leaves, by the way. So you can have that bold texture with that technique, and you're also still providing the food sources for whatever feeds on basswood. Sidebar, if you have an ash tree that gets cut down, I would not have it stumped out. I would let those shoots grow up so that they are at least food for all the things that feed on ash leaves until ash develops a resistance to emerald ash borer.
Okay.
Hopefully that does the job.
I've got a couple questions I think that are related from Joan, asking about rock gardens and how to work irrigation into a garden for the Haliburton area or up in the Canadian Shield where you've got a little bit more rock closer to the surface and not quite that depth as on the Moraine.
Yes, definitely. Yes, the Moraine drains very well, being the Moraine and all. I would suggest, so if you're having a commercial installer, like an irrigation professional, do it, then they can install commercial grade irrigation systems that are drip irrigation. So they release a very controlled amount of water so that you're not causing erosion and you're not putting on more than is necessary. If they're doing their job, they might connect it to soil moisture meters so that it turns off when there's sufficient moisture in the soil. If you're not going that route, and I'm not here to plug any one company, but and sadly they don't pay me to do this, but Lee Valley has some amazing products for drip irrigation, do-it-yourself kits that I've used in my own landscapes and in the landscapes of my customers. And there's a couple of different kits that you can get. There's a little sort of drip head that puts the water right exactly at the base of the plant that needs it, or you can have this sort of sweating hose, a little micro sweating hose that leads to the garden, and that might be the way that you need to avoid the erosion but get the water right where you want it and without wasting any.
Okay. And we had a similarly related question from Kara, who has a slope in the backyard and all the rain and meltwater runs to and puddles at the bottom of the slope. Is that where something like that drip irrigation could work? Or what would help soak up that water, or should it be redirected to a small pond?
Well, there's a bunch of things that you can do, of course, and again, no one solution, lots of little solutions. So I might look at tiering the hill a little bit. What I've done on some occasions is I've created a back and forth, almost like switchback. And if you've got a hillside, for heaven's sakes, take that pond and pump the water up partway up the hillside, so then you have it flow down, and then you're creating, people spend a lot of money creating topography. If you have the topography, use it to create a beautiful water garden. That can be a real opportunity. Now, if it's on a hillside and you're using rubber pond liner to create it, it can be a challenge in that it often needs a little bit of tweaking. A couple of times a year, you've got to just sort of adjust all the rocks because they tend to creep down. The other way to do it would be to build it out of reinforced fiberglass, fiberglass reinforced concrete, just like they do at Chicago Botanic Gardens. It's the same climate as we have, but you build it with sloped sides so that when the water freezes, it pushes up, not out. And you build it of fiberglass reinforced concrete so it's good and strong. And those would be a couple of great ways of dealing with that. Now, if you must irrigate it, then certainly the drip irrigation systems would be the way to go.
Okay. The next question we have is from Donna. Would it be possible to use those Envirolok bags for a raised veggie bed?
Absolutely, I've done it. Works like a charm. We even cut little holes in the side of it, and planted tomato plants in there, and then pinned the tomato plants to the outside of the bags. We used cherry tomatoes that climbed, and that worked really, really, really well.
That's really cool.
Yes, actually it was.
The question from Allison about the evaporation ponds. How quickly do they evaporate, and would that be standing water that might attract mosquitoes?
No, it wouldn't be standing water. Good question. It wouldn't be standing water because you're going to be putting, like any pond, you're going to be putting a pump in it, so, and a waterfall or a fountain or something like that, so that the water is flowing. As long as the water is moving, then you don't have issues with mosquitoes, and same with algae. You're going to plant it up just like you would any other kind of pond, with water lilies and sedge grasses around the edges and all sorts of water plants, but you're definitely going to have it flowing. Now, I had a customer who thought they had a leak in their pond years ago, and so I set her a mission, and I told her to measure, first of all, unplug it and see if the water still went down. If it didn't keep going down, then the leak was in the waterfall somewhere. And it turned out that it was not a leak in the waterfall. So then she started monitoring in the mornings and the evenings, and she found out that the pond, whether it was running or not, was losing an inch a day, and it was all evaporation. So your pond will lose an inch a day to evaporation. So you may actually want to attach it a hose so that you can fill it if necessary. But generally speaking, Mother Nature will do the job of filling it for you.
Cool. And one more question from Suzanne. Suzanne has a rain barrel that always has water in the bottom. Is there a plant to put in there rather than putting a mosquito net on the top?
Most plants wouldn't tolerate that level of flooding, and more to the point, that level of shade for very long, because if it's in the bottom of a rain barrel, it's only going to get water, sunlight at high noon. So most plants are going to handle that. There is a way around that, though. You can use dunks. You get these little sort of like pucks that float, and they have a type of bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis in them, and they only kill mosquitoes. So they're not going to hurt your fish, they're not going to hurt your plants, but it will take care of the mosquitoes that are in there. So that's probably your best bet.
Okay. And it looks like that is all of the questions that I have received.
People are more than welcome to reach out if they think of things later on as well.
Perfect. And like Sean mentioned, you can give him an email. His contact information is in the downloads in that section there in the handouts. His presentation is there. So thank you so much, Sean, for presenting for us today. Definitely some great ideas for what to do with some rainwater, and definitely reminds me I need to water my houseplants before they expire. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming out and tuning in tonight.
Thanks very much.